So this afternoon we have a 2004 GMC 2500 HD with the 6.6 Duramax. I believe it's the LLY engine. The truck is in beautiful condition, but it's leaking coolant. Now, if you look, there's evidence of coolant. You can see the orange residue around just below the oil filter housing. And I'll use the black light here. You can see the coolant, the orange traces from the black light, and it's coming up from up high, the back. At first I thought maybe it was the oil filter housing. I'm not sure if that can leak coolant, but you can see dried coagulated coolant in various places around. I wonder if there's a passage on the back of the block. I don't know how well this is showing up on the camera, but you can see the evidence of the orange dye in the black light. Anyways, we're going to see what's common to leak in this area. So here's what I found. Apparently there is a coolant passage in the flywheel housing cover, that passage between the right and left cylinder head that runs through the flywheel housing cover. So there could be an O-ring on there that's leaking. Replaced flywheel housing cover O-rings. Replaced flywheel housing cover. Resealed, replaced, repaired flywheel housing cover. Trying to pressure test the cooling system, but I don't have an adapter for this filler cap. So I'm trying to look at a picture of this flywheel housing to see if it would be leaking in that general vicinity. That the oil filter housing also is a cooler, but it appears to be coming from above that, because the traces of dried coolant are basically from the flywheel housing area. So we're going to continue. So all the research that I've done so far indicates that this aluminum elbow right here I'm pointing to, which is bolted to the engine oil cooler and bolted to the bell housing flywheel crossover, is leaking, and the coolant is leaking from up in this area around this upper bolt. So that would make sense. But to fix it, we got to take the engine oil cooler off. So we need a gasket for this. We need gaskets and O-rings, square O-rings for this. And then there's a coolant pipe way up here, right there, that transfers coolant from the water pump, apparently, with a couple of O-rings on that. So we're going to have to order up some gaskets and seals for this thing and go from there. Take this oil cooler off and reseal this housing, and hopefully that fixes it. I've looked around the back of the number 6 and 8 injectors to see if there's any signs of coolant around the injectors, and there isn't. So we'll get some parts ordered up for this thing. So here's some service information I found in all data showing that engine oil cooler. There is a pipe that runs from the back of the water pump. Let's see here. There's the area where it's leaking. It's leaking in this bolt area right here. And there's a square O-ring on this and a gasket on here. But to get that out, you need to take the cooler off. And that requires removal of the inner fender and this coolant tube. So there's an O-ring here, a gasket here, a gasket on the housing, or a couple of O-rings, that square O-ring and square gasket. So we're going to order up some parts for this thing, and I'll video the process of removing these parts. So this morning we're going to attempt to replace the gaskets and seals on the engine oil filter housing or oil cooler. It necessitates removing the left front wheel, raising it up on a hoist, removing the inner fender skirt, and the oil filter and housing. Here is a list of the parts. that I feel isn't required. Hopefully we need all of these and we don't have anything missing. So let's get the wheel off and the fender skirt out so we can access that coolant tube. So removing this charge air cooler pipe means moving this clamp, and the bolt will be rusty. It's a 1/4 inch fine thread stud, so if you run a thread chaser on it first, it cleans up the rust, and then the nut should come off. Don't lose your thread. Once that charge air pipe is out, once you loosen off the clamp at the top and bottom, bring it out this way. This is the pipe we have going after, because this coolant tube goes from the water pump housing to the engine oil cooler. So we're going to remove these 2 nuts and we're going to drain the coolant now. So that's the cooler we're going after right there. I got most of the bolts removed. Still got 1 12mm nut here. There are 2 up in there that are a real challenge to get to. Well, not that bad, but bad enough, and they're pretty tight. So I found this long flex-headed ratchet 1/4 inch drive with a stubby 12mm socket seemed to break it loose pretty good. I tried a combination wrench, but I couldn't get enough force on it. So I loosened off all the bolts in the housing there, and the last nut, when I cracked that loose, coolant started running out of there. I don't like touching the radiator drain cock on a 16, 17-year-old truck, because it's plastic and it'll likely break, and then we'll be into a bigger shit show. So clean drain pan, catch the coolant if you're going to reuse it, and let it run out where it runs out. So there's the outside portion of the oil filter adapter with the cooler off. There's an O-ring on it. I'll show you what it looks like. It makes it a bit of a challenge to pull out this O-ring on the bottom here, right here. So the housing comes off, but you have to kind of wiggle it back and forth to get it to come out. Now, in hindsight, I didn't need to remove that nut that holds the cooler to the back. I'm not sure if we have seals for this, but we're going to check into it. I think we do. Next is to remove the adapter to the engine block. This one up here. So I got 2 more bolts up top. Looks like. And then you can see that coolant pipe right up there. That has to be, the service literature says to undo it and remove it. You can't remove it because there's studs at the front and it's flanged. So you got to drop this back. In hindsight, I probably should have left a nut on there to keep that pipe from, well, maybe it'll come back and down and come out with the housing. So this nut this bolt's a bit of a challenge in here on this angle bracket here, but we'll get it. So that lower nut or bolt comes out, but it's hard to get your fingers in there, and you can't get a box end wrench on it because it hits that stud. So I removed that stud on the bottom corner. It's you need an E8 bit because the stud has a head in it, so you can grab it with a E8 socket and take the stud out. Should be able to get that out of there now. So that coolant pipe needs to be bolted back up to the front, but leave it loose about a 1/4 inch so that you can pull this housing down and then wiggle it back. And I had to put a pry bar between the housing and the motor mount to push back on this side of to wiggle it out of there because it's stuck in there pretty good. Now you can take that coolant pipe out of there. So you have to have it loose on the front so that you can pull it down to get it out. I also removed that 90-degree bracket. That's what was actually leaking on this, is that gasket on that 90-degree bracket on the back of the housing. There it is there. That's what was leaking, is that square O-ring there in that area there. You can see the dried coolant on it. And or this gasket on the front here. But if you take both studs out, then you can wiggle this 90-degree elbow out, and then this housing will come back and disconnect from the front pipe. So we're going to get everything all cleaned up and ready to put back together again. So there's that coolant pipe. You can pull it straight back. Like I said, loosen off these 2 bolts, or 2 nuts I should say, they're studs, and leave them about 1/4 of an inch so you can pull the pipe back and down. If you don't leave them in there, you can't get it out with the housing. And this is the O-ring that's stuck in that aluminum housing. So we got all new parts for this. We're going to clean everything up now. So we got the flange clean on the water pump housing for that coolant pipe. Got the elbow cleaned and the new O-ring, square O-ring in here with dielectric grease. The gasket. I'm going to put sealant on the gasket spray. Got this coolant pipe cleaned up. Give it a coat of paint. It was a little rusty on the outside. And the O-ring area cleaned in here and some dielectric grease on that. So we're ready to reassemble. I just got to look at the housings on the transmission. So there's the back housing and the 90-degree elbow installed. It works best if you pull those 2 studs out, that way you can clean the gasket surface. The pipe's reinstalled, flange is bolted at the front. I've got the new square O-ring here stuck on there with some dielectric grease. Hopefully it doesn't slip out of place. You got to be careful that doesn't stay up there very well. And now we're ready to put the housing in. We've got new O-rings on the housing. New O-ring on here, and we're ready to put it back together. So there, it's all back together. Just put a new oil filter on. I'm going to check the oil life, see if it needs an oil change. But this is residue from the coolant that leaked out of it. We're going to fill the cooling system, start it up and run it, and make sure there's no leaks. So there's the wheel and inner fender skirt and charge air cooler pipe back on. No more leak. It was leaking in this corner here. You can see the residue on the housing there. It was actually leaking from that 90-degree elbow, but you got to do all of that work just to get at that elbow. So we'll call it a wrap. Thanks for watching.